Does anyone come to mind when you think about, if you were sitting in my chair 20 years ago, who comes to mind as biggest early influences in your career?
Well, I think you already know the answer. I mean, my father, Tom Collins, was definitely, my mentor.
Yeah.
I didn't even realize it until later in life.
Yeah.
But I had the wonderful opportunity to work with him and run a business with him between 2002 and 2007. And so getting to work together with him was really interesting. But I had asked his advice for many years, and I would say the first time I really applied some of his systems was during a time when I worked for Colgate-Palmolive and I was working in Eastern Europe. I was stationed in Romania, and the foreword to his book, The Language of Excellence, talks about my experience where I said, how in the world am I going to teach people who've grown up with communism, capitalism, and all the business principles that we, I guess, take for granted, from our education and direct experience. And so I grabbed my dad's materials, which he's developed to run his companies over the years, and I used them to quite good effect. And ever since, we're talking about 30, 40 years now, that his framework for establishing culture, creating alignment on the team, creating a common language that can be easily understood top to bottom about how to do things right, if you will, in business. I've been adapting that framework for a very long time. So, without a doubt, he's the guy. But all his content, all his material was not original. He took the greats, Peter Drucker, Deming, Jim Collins. He took all the greats and tried to distill those into a system that would work for not just a CEO reading all the management books, but for everybody.
Right.
Something that's accessible.
Accessible, yeah. Yeah, so we're talking about the language of excellence. And when did your dad formalize it into a published materials where it wasn't just his notes?
Well, it existed probably in the late 70s. I can't definitively say that. Certainly in the 80s. And at that time, it was called the ABCs of InSearch. InSearch was his advisory business. I think he got the name from In Search of Excellence, so that book. But that's what it was called. Later, it became the Language of Excellence. And so it's been around for 40 plus years.
And explain to us, when you say a language of excellence, explain the significance of that. Just like, I know we've talked about it before, it's like a system, but explain to us why it's a collection of principles. Like, how is it a language?
So if you had asked him, he would say, yes, it's important to understand that this is a toolkit. This is a system. Most management books, I think, are advice, right? Here's how to do it right. Here's how to do it wrong. Or here's something new and special that you didn't know before. Read my book and you'll be smarter. What he tried to do is say, look, I need a way that's efficient. And what I mean in this context is to be able to communicate to everyone at my company about complex, perhaps complex, business concepts and principles that I need everybody to understand and apply in their everyday work. And I can't make everybody read 100 management books and go through this. So how can I make this easier and more accessible? And so what he did is he created an iconography framework. And if you look at the book that's published, and someday, we have to reissue this and modernize it, each icon was expressed on a flip chart. So yes, there was a day when offices did not have whiteboards in them, And so he wanted to be able to draw an image, an icon, a symbol that was representative of a complex concept. If you were to say to somebody, or I'll take a very simple, one of his icons was a stick of dynamite, just says TNT. It's today, not tomorrow. Simple principle. But instead of explaining the, why procrastination's bad and all these other things, he might walk around, and if the team was not being proactive enough, he might just walk around and say, hey, everybody, TNT. Or draw it up, and people would know that. So it was a shorthand. And so he created a set of these icons around principles like strategic planning or management, et cetera, and as examples. But he never intended that to be the end of the line. He wanted people to understand that you can use the system, you can create your own set of guiding principles and icons and flashcards, and that I did find in my career this was a very effective way to speed up the assimilation of business strategy, business concepts, and then made it very easy to communicate and remind people about these principles on a day-to-day basis and change behavior. Instead of going to a management training once every 6 months and listening to lectures. It's just much more practical.
And what I like about the framework too is it's very accessible, and it like you said, it's a shorthand. When we use them at MasterBorn, people, like you said, you just have to say the word. You don't need to stand up there and give a lecture. No one has the capacity to consume the long form of all these principles at any given time. But it's something to always check back to, and you can say the word, and it's the memory's jogged.
I think one you like is ceremonialism.
Yes, I love ceremonialism.
And the principle here is simple, that when good things happen, you need a ceremony. And everybody might agree and say, yes, of course, but the principle is you would talk to the managers and you say, are you practicing ceremonialism? How are you doing it? And you remind people that it's not just understanding what ceremonialism is, but the value of doing that consistently and how that affects culture and morale and performance. And so you can easily have a conversation and say, have you thought about how you're going to create some ceremony around this new product launch or sales performance? And so this is a system of accountability as well.
What are some of the, what's your favorite language of excellence maxim? Like which one do you feel like you come to the most?
I often refer to the opportunity wedge, which I don't believe is in the language of excellence book. Maybe it is.
It is.
It is. It wasn't in the first one. And trying to explain this in simple terms, it's that the choices we make today can either expand the available opportunities in the future or constrain them. And that leaders who have to make decisions today that affect the future, and often not just tomorrow, but 2, 3, 5 years from now, how do you make sure that you're not making a choice that will dramatically reduce an opportunity for a company to grow someday? Where I encounter this most often is in software design, where, people, engineers will take, or businesses will take shortcuts. They make sense at the time. Maybe it makes things easier, faster, cheaper, who knows. But later they regret these things. Sometimes this is referred to as technical debt, but that's different. Technical debt, in my view, is maybe you didn't design something ideally, or you get behind, and it's just the normal sort of decay of things, and you underinvest and you don't modernize. But if you decide that you don't need certain data or aren't going to ingest certain data because it's a problem or it makes negotiating your first deals too hard, and then all of a sudden 3 years later you find out, oh my gosh, we could build a much better, more exciting product if only we had this data. You can't go back in time and fix that. So that's an example. In your personal life, if you get in trouble, don't get an education, make a lot of bad choices, etc., chances are maybe you won't have access to certain opportunities. So it's it's the same kind of lesson for life: is make good choices today, be healthy. A great example. If you don't take, as you're almost 40 now, right?
Yeah, almost 40.
Well, you're even learning, an elite athlete. That, if you don't make good choices when you're 20, 25, 30, unwinding those when you're 40, 50, 60 is a real issue. And so that applies in business too. And so getting decision makers to consider the opportunity wedge, when we often don't, is one I'm almost always referencing.
I love the concept of the opportunity wedge. I think it's probably one of the first ones that you taught me, but both by example and introduced me to the concept. But the way that I think about it the most for me is in my personal network. I've thought of my personal network as an opportunity wedge for the last 20 years, and every time you meet someone, it widens the wedge again. And there's been a lot of examples where people that I met 10, 20 or more years ago are come back around, and I think about that as the opportunity wedge. So every time you make a new connection or kind to someone or add value to them.
If you're thinking about the opportunity wedge, it'll certainly make you treat people better.
Yes, and it all builds on itself, and that's been I remind myself of that one often because it's I'm living the benefits of seeds that I planted and the things that I've added to this wedge in the last 20 years.
Well, I know there's one that's not in the book. It's on my list. It's what I call the black hole, which sounds much more negative, honestly. One thing I've come to learn is that many professionals, particularly earlier in their career, but that's not always true, view a delegated responsibility or task as inherently inferior. Meaning that if it was delegated to me and the boss didn't take it, the boss must not care. Nothing could be further from the truth. If a good leader is delegating, it's because they're choosing to assign that responsibility to someone who's best for that responsibility or task. And the CEO or whoever the leader is in this case is probably not. And good leaders don't delegate unimportant things to people. They allocate capital by saying, look, this is something that's important to do. We need to do it. We need to do it right. And Gray, you're the best person to do it. But I think because there's this misunderstanding about the nature of delegation that many professionals assume that because, the boss doesn't want to do it, that they don't want to hear about it. That they want to be left alone and they just want to get rid of this. Again, nothing could be further from the truth. So I do tell people, don't put me in the black hole though, which means once the agreement is made, Gray, I need you to do X, you say, you got it. That then it's the black hole. There's no communication, no light goes in, light goes in, light doesn't come out. And I want to tell people, look, this is collaborative. Let's talk about it. I want to know what you're thinking. How are you approaching this task? Are you running into issues? It's important to me, and I'm here to help you. So don't put me in the black hole. So there's another one, maybe a little less positive.
I like that one a lot. So what I wanted to ask a little bit. So since the language of excellence has been very important to me. Obviously, you've passed on many of these lessons, and at MasterBorn, we've implemented one of this. We've had the copy of the book in the office, since the beginning. It was kind of one of the founding pillars of the company. We want to bring language of excellence to the digital age. The book has been in print for a number of years, like you said, and we want to bring the language of excellence to the digital world, to the web browser. Tell us about the experience so far, and how do you think the language of excellence continues to be relevant in 2024?
Well, again, I think the principles that are incorporated into the framework are, shall I say, timeless. So I don't see. I think the concepts are relevant. I think the the communication framework is probably more powerful, especially in a world of remote work.
Yeah.
You know, where it is harder to communicate to people and to get alignment.
Yeah.
But that also means that we need different ways of distributing that content and making it and increasing its utility if people wanted to actually employ it. Nobody's using flip charts anymore.
Right.
You know.
Right.
We now could crowdsource case studies around the use of the framework. It would have been very difficult to do before. My father, as you know, passed away in August of last year. And, you know, a regret of mine is he and I had talked about, you know, publishing a new version or bringing the content, you know, into the modern age. Scary to say. So it's very meaningful to me to deliver on that.
Right.
I'm sad that he'll never get to see, you know, the evolution of his concept, and he would have really enjoyed working on it. So I definitely appreciate the MasterBorn and your willingness to collaborate on this. And so in this way, I guess I'm a client.
Yeah, that's right.
For Language of Excellence too. Call it ABCs of InSearch stuff.